How many of y'all were old enough to remember 1996? All right, so the first service, everybody was old enough. I knew this service about 50-50. Yeah, 1996 is a unique year for Christmas because of the Tickle Me Elmo doll. How many of y'all remember the Tickle Me Elmo doll? Yeah, those who remember 1996, exactly, because it was massive. I mean, every child wanted the Tickle Me Elmo doll. In fact, people were absolutely going crazy. As soon as a new shipment arrived into a store, in minutes, the Tickle Me Elmo doll was gone. You actually had people that were actually getting one, $30, turning around, selling it to desperate parents for $1,000. It was crazy. You had parents in the middle of toy aisles in stores fist fighting one another over a Tickle Me Elmo doll. I mean, if you were alive in 1996, you were scratching your head thinking, what in the world's going wrong with our nation, unless you were one of those parents. And don't tell me later if you were, because I'd be greatly disappointed in you. But nonetheless, what in the world was driving parents to go crazy over the Tickle Me Elmo doll? It was the media exerting social pressure. They were building this huge narrative that if your child doesn't get the Tickle Me Elmo doll, then your child's whole Christmas is going to be ruined. And under these social pressures, parents were giving in, and they were losing their minds. Now, lest we blame parents, from 1996, this kind of stuff this kind of social pressure still exists today. Because there are young people that I hear about that say, Mom, Dad, if I don't have this gaming platform where I can play with these other kids around the world, I'm just a nobody. Or we've got teenagers that's like, I must have this new phone, otherwise my whole social life is ruined. And we've got parents who believe that their children must have certain brands of clothes. They got to drive certain cars when they turn 16. They've got to be in certain social clubs, organizations, and certain schools in order to give them the best launch pad into adult life. And as parents, if I don't give them all this stuff, they're just going to be utter failures when they become adults. Now, where does this kind of wrong-headed thinking come from? Social pressure. You know what I always say to the pastors, Jesus had a rock, a tree, and a hill. He's got enough to preach. And we got all of these things in our building and all. We don't have to have any of these things, and our families don't have to have any of those things that society is telling us they must have in order to live a full life. But yet, social pressure is pushing us. Now, what's at the root of social pressure? Several years ago, I heard the acronym FOMO. How many of y'all know what FOMO is? FOMO, the fear of missing out. That's at the root of all of these social pressures. Fear, the fear of missing out. Now, what in this series, today's message is, it's talking about pressures. Christians are not immune to pressures. We're not immune to the social pressures that everybody else has. But there's another pressure that we recognize in the Bible and in our lives. It is a spiritual pressure given to us by God. And what I want us to see in today's message from Matthew chapter 1, verses 18 through 25, I want us to see that as God's people, just like Joseph had to deal with these two pressures in his life, in the decisions that he was making, we've got to deal with these two pressures in life. And we've got to learn how to give in to God's spiritual pressure and how not to give in to the world's social pressures. And sometimes this is difficult. And sometimes we need to be reminded of it. And that's what I want us to see today from this Christmas event, all of the Christmas event pressures that Joseph was feeling, and learn from his experience how we should deal with pressures in our own lives today. That's what I want us to see today from Matthew chapter 1, verses 18 through 25. The first thing this morning, as it pertains to Joseph, is that Christmas, it was full of relational pressures, verses 18 and 19. It says, now the birth of Jesus Christ was as follows. After his mother Mary was betrothed to Joseph, before they came together, she was found with child of the Holy Spirit. Then Joseph, her husband, being a just man and not wanting to make her a public example, was minded to put her away secretly. Now, I want you to notice in this text, I want to point out to you two different pressures. One is God's spiritual pressure. The other one was other people's social pressure that Joseph was feeling. And these are the same two pressures that you are going to feel for the rest of your life, no matter how old or how young you are. The rest of your life, if you are a child of God, you're going to feel God's spiritual pressure in your life like Joseph did. That's the first thing. God puts spiritual pressure on his people. Again, verse 18, after his mother, talking about Jesus, his mother Mary, was betrothed to Joseph, before they came together, she was found with child of the Holy Spirit. Notice the time referencing. After Mary was betrothed to Joseph, but before that marriage was fully consummated or finalized, in this in-between period, between the betrothal and the finalization of the marriage, that's when Mary was found to be with child. Now that's a problem. That is a problem socially, legally, and religiously in ancient Israel. Because, as I told you last week, the betrothal process was not like our engagement. Our engagements today, they are not legal. They are not married yet, so they're still making their own decisions as individual single people. But in the betrothal process of the ancient Jewish culture, when they became betrothed, they were legally married. In fact, you will see, even though they're in the betrothal process, Mary is called Joseph's wife. And that means that everything legal associated with a marriage was applicable to Joseph and Mary during the betrothal process. That means that if one spouse cheated on another spouse, that was not just a bad, immoral thing. That was an illegal thing. That was an irreligious thing. And all of the people in the community said that was not socially acceptable. Now, that's different than our engagement, but that was the environment in which we see Joseph and Mary at this particular time. And because it was a legal matter, then if one spouse during the betrothal period, after the betrothal, before the wedding's finalized, then if one spouse cheats against another spouse, that is legally prosecutable and punishable. Now, what would the possible punishments be for in a betrothed relationship, one spouse cheating on the other spouse? Number one, it could be divorce. Remember, they're legally married. And number two, it could be execution. Because under the Mosaic law, when two people are married, you will read, and one cheats on the other one, that's adultery, then the person who cheats and the person with whom they are cheated, according to the Mosaic law, they are to be executed before the community. And it would be a very severe warning. This is unacceptable to God among his people. Now, we are not bound by the Old Testament law, but we do see God's view of how serious the institution of marriage is supposed to be. And we think engagement, they're not married yet. But in this day and time, betrothal, they were legally married. And it was in this time that Mary comes up pregnant. Now, do you think that God understood? Do you think God is smart enough that he understood that when he came to Mary during this period of time between betrothal and the finalization of marriage, that God understood that people, when they find out that Mary is pregnant, there's going to be a collective gasp, a social gasp, a religious gasp, and a legal gasp. Do you think God understood that? Absolutely. Now let me ask you this. Do you think that God understood that when he selected a betrothed woman, that gasp would not only be directed toward the woman, but also toward the betrothed husband as well? I think God's smart enough that he knew this. He knew that under these circumstances, that when the lady becomes pregnant, everybody's going to look to the man because they understand biology. And if the man's like, wasn't me, then everybody's going to be saying, then who was it, young lady? Because everybody understands biology. Now, could God have selected a single woman who was not betrothed so that the reputational damage would only be isolated to one person, one of his people, rather than two? Sure, he could. But that's not what God chose. God chose that this betrothed young lady and her betrothed husband, both were going to have to deal with this supernatural conception and pregnancy. And God was okay doing that. God was okay putting this kind of spiritual pressure on two of his children who were faithful and just before him. He was okay doing that. Why was God okay doing that? It is because God is working out an eternal agenda beyond just our individual 70 or so years. And God understands that he may put you in a very dire predicament because he's trying to reach this person over here, and it's a heaven-hell kind of situation. You know, he was willing to put Mary and Joseph in this kind of pressure pot because it was determinative of our opportunity for heaven or hell. So why do we think that we would be any different, that God would never put us under spiritual pressure? Don't think that, because He will. And He will put us under this kind of spiritual pressure, knowing that it is going to trigger a social pressure that nobody really wants. But that's just naturally what's going to happen. That's the second thing. First of all, God puts spiritual pressure on His people, but He understands when this happens, the world often puts social pressure on His people. Look at verse 19 again. Then Joseph, her husband, notice the legal language there. Joseph, her husband, being a just man and not wanting to make her a public example, was minded to put her away secretly. Now, I want you to notice the adjective describing Joseph. It is the adjective just. He was a just man. In whose eyes? I contend he was a just man in God's eyes. I believe that God knew that Mary was a just young woman and that Joseph was a just man, because I believe that God wanted His only begotten Son to be born, yes, supernatural conception of love, but He wanted His Son to have a two-parent, stable, godly home. And therefore, I think He selected Mary, and the pastors and I last Monday had this conversation. Do you think that God selected Mary in consideration of the justness of her betrothed husband? It could have been another lady, but maybe the other lady didn't have a just husband like Mary did. And we don't know for sure. That's something we might ask the Lord one day, but I think that is a possibility, because Joseph is described as being a just man. I think he was just before the Lord, but as a just man before the Lord, I think he also had a reputation of being a just man there in Nazareth with the people who knew him. They knew he was a just man. Now, here's the thing. When you've got a particular reputation, most people want to live up to that reputation. I've seen people who have bad reputations, and they do everything in the world to make sure that that reputation persists. And I've seen people who have good reputations, and they do all they can do to make sure their good reputation persists. Joseph had the reputation before God and everybody else of being a just man. And now God puts His spiritual pressure on him by saying, your betrothed wife is supernaturally pregnant. Now, he's not heard that yet, as we'll see in a moment, but that's what kind of pressure God is going to put on Joseph. And Joseph's got to figure out in his mind, what do I do under this social pressure that I'm going to be feeling because of Mary's condition? What do I do? Now, God puts His people in pressure situations where, in order to obey God, they are going to be going in opposition to the social pressure around them. This happens all the time. I know international missionaries whose parents, when they heard this young couple say, we feel God calling us to the international mission field, the parents say, are you crazy? Do you know how much we spent on your college education so that you might be this or you might be that? And you're telling me now you're going to throw it all away so that you can go off to some godforsaken third world country and just tell people the story that you learned in Sunday school. Why did we do all of this if this is what you're going to wind up doing? Do you see the kind of logic a parent would have at that moment? But out of just confusion, troubledness, they exert pressure on their young children, grown nonetheless. I've known where young couples with young children, they don't feel called to be a missionary. He doesn't feel called to be a preacher or anything like that. But what they do is they know a church planter who is moving to another state to plant a church, and they feel drawn by the Holy Spirit to go, quit their job here, leave their grandparents and parents and all here, and to go to this other state and be a part of this church plant. They're just regular church member in the church plant, but they've got to go find another job, find everything new, because God's calling them to a non-ministerial role, but to be a part of a church plant. You know what parents and grandparents often think about that? They think they're crazy. Imagine outside of the United States, imagine a Muslim-dominated country where a man hears the gospel, puts his faith in Jesus Christ, and renounces his Muslim faith. And he comes to his family and says, I have been saved, and beyond that, God is calling me to be a pastor here in this Muslim-dominated area. What kind of social pressure do you think that man's going to feel? Folks, that man is not only going to be disowned by his family, he's going to be persecuted by his family. And even as one family in our own church experienced in an African nation, he may even be executed by his family. Did God not understand by calling this person to do this that it's going to go against the social norms and the social desires of family, friends, and community members? Yeah, God understood all of that. Just like he understands it today. And sometimes he's still calling his people to do things. A spiritual pressure of a call to go against the social pressure, even of people who love us. He's been doing this for thousands of years. So why should we expect any difference? Well, this Christmas event shows us the relational kind of pressures that God will call his people to do. Now, that being the case, then the people who are put into these pressure situations, what do they have to do? Logically, they got to make a decision. That's the second part. Christmas, this event, is full of decisional pressures. Now I want to read the rest of the text for us. Verse 19 again through verse 25. Then Joseph, her husband, being a just man and not wanting to make her, Mary, a public example, was minded to put her away secretly. But while he thought about these things, behold, an angel of the Lord appeared to him in a dream, saying, Joseph, wait a minute, Joseph, right? Angels got to have deep voices, right? Joseph, son of David, do not be afraid to take to you Mary your wife, for that which is conceived in her is of the Holy Spirit. And she will bring forth a son, and you shall call his name Jesus, for he will save his people from their sins. So then all of this was done that it might be fulfilled, which was spoken by the Lord through the prophet, saying, Behold, the virgin shall be with child, there's the conception, and bear a son, still in that virgin condition, the birth, the conception and the birth, and bear the son, and they shall call his name Emmanuel, which is translated God with us. Now, then Joseph, being aroused from sleep, did as the angel of the Lord commanded him, and took to him his wife, and did not know her till she had brought forth her firstborn son, and he called, notice, he called, who? Joseph called his name Jesus. Now, did God, unbeknownst to God, realize later in the process, because I have instructed Mary to allow her participation in the grand narrative of salvation to be that supernaturally she would conceive, she would be pregnant with the only begotten Son of God. Did I just not think through this well enough that I didn't realize all the social pressures that her betrothed husband would have, Joseph? Did God let up on the pressure, the spiritual pressure on Joseph, just because Joseph would sense that there would be public pressure, social pressure against him? Absolutely not. Because God is fine calling his people into pressure situations. In fact, I contend we're still talking about Mary and Joseph because there was so much pressure. We're still talking about Mary and Joseph because God was willing to call his people into this. And throughout church history, we still talk about certain missionaries and certain preachers and certain non-ministerial people because of the pressure God did call them into. See, God often gets more glory when he does call us into pressure situations. And here's the thing. When he calls the individual into the pressure situation and they say yes, that person begins to trust God more and more. The individual relationship grows and the glory of God grows. Often when God calls us into pressure situations. Now, what was the pressure situation? The third part of verse 18, she was found with child. Now, that verb found, what does that mean? It means there was a moment when she was unfound. Now, you all know biology enough to know that, when a lady conceives, there's several weeks that she can hide it, right? But you all also know that after a period of time, she's not going to hide it as well, right? The text says she was found with child. Now, who found her with child? We're not told exactly. We do know that Joseph finds out that she's pregnant, and he understands that's not my baby. And we're assuming there's other people that are finding out. Maybe Joseph's mom and dad, maybe Mary's mom and dad, maybe the siblings and the cousins, and all these people are finding out because Mary's beginning to show some. And Joseph realizes this is a social problem because everybody's finding out about Mary's pregnancy right here. So I want you to notice that Joseph was concerned about this social pressure that he was feeling. How do I know that? Look in verse 19. Because it says that Joseph was not wanting to make her a public example. He was mindful to put her away secretly. It's the public and the secretness that lets us know that Joseph was fully aware of all the social opinions that were floating around the little area of Nazareth up there. In other words, that town had trouble with gossip, just like any town today has trouble with gossip. He was worried about that, and that's why he's trying to formulate in his mind, how am I going to remain just? How am I going to remain just before God and my community? And what we see is at this point is that Joseph begins to formulate a plan. Now Joseph's got a plan, and God's got a plan, and the two plans don't jive. And often that's the way it is even with God's children today. Lots of times we get a plan, we make a plan for our lives, and only later find out that God's plan for our lives isn't jiving with our plan. And when that happens, we got a decision to make. Whose plan are we going to follow? Well, what we learned is that the wrong response to the social pressure, like Joseph was feeling at this moment, is fear and disobedience. Back to verse 20. Behold, an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph. Notice how? In a dream. Now, that's very significant to me personally because I don't know about you all, but when I go back and I look at Zacharias, the angel Gabriel appeared to Zacharias in the temple face to face. The angel Gabriel appeared to Mary face to face. But now we see that an angel comes to Joseph, how? In a dream. I don't know about you all, but when I'm stressing over things, I have a tendency at night when my brain is shutting down and it's categorizing everything the way scientists say our brains do. I don't know if they know what they're talking about, but that's what they say. I have a tendency to think when I have these crazy dreams going on about things that actually are happening in my life, I'm like, well, that was just a dream. That was just a dream. God came to Joseph in a dream. And when we see in a few moments the response that Joseph had, I'm like, man, what a just man of faith. Because he could have dismissed it just as a dream. Not like Zacharias and Mary. Just a dream. Go on with my good plans. So we notice then that the Lord appeared to him in a dream, saying, Joseph, son of David, do not be afraid to take to you Mary your wife, for that which is conceived in her is of the Holy Spirit. So notice God's plan. It's totally different than Joseph's plan. Joseph's plan was that he was going to not make her a public example, but he was going to put her away secretly. But God's plan was, no. Don't be afraid. Take to you Mary your wife. Now, what is God's plan and how is it different than Joseph's plan? Well, when it says over there, Joseph's plan was to put her away, the Greek word there to put away is the same Greek word that in other places in the New Testament that is translated as divorce. It's the same Greek word. So his plan was as privately and as minimalized as possible, I'm going to quietly divorce her and we're going to try to go on without too much reputational damage and other things. Too much fallout from this very bad situation. What's God say? God says, no, under normal circumstances that might be a good plan, but my plan is that you take her very publicly now. Now remember, after she was betrothed, until that marriage was finalized, it was in this middle ground that Mary became pregnant. Now, typically, this middle ground would last maybe up to a year. Now that she's found out, she's beginning to show. Now Joseph is trying to come up with a plan, and God says, you got the wrong plan. Here's the plan. You don't divorce her, you take her proudly. Now, what does that mean from Joseph's point of view? That means reputationally, when he takes her into her house, what is he saying publicly when the gossips are all interpreting his actions? He's saying publicly, this is my baby, even though he knew this was not my baby. God, do you understand that when I take her like this, then it makes me look bad instead of her? You think God understood that? Absolutely. See, God is willing to damage the reputation, the social reputation of his people in order to accomplish his will. Do you realize that? He's willing to damage your reputation in order to advance his will. Think about Noah. How many people, when Noah was building that big old boat, how many of the people in the community thought Noah was a crazy man? Pretty much everybody, right? But he wasn't crazy, was he? He was just following God's crazy plan for his life. How about Abram? When Abram had this conversation with a God that he didn't even know because he was raised in a pagan land, and this God that he didn't even know and his family didn't know said, just pack up your family and take off, and I'll tell you when to stop, and there you'll start a new family, in a new land, that kind of stuff. When Abram told his family, Terah said, I'm right there. His daddy said, I'll go with you. But all of his cousins and aunts and uncles, all of them probably thought, you're a nutcase. Think about God's only begotten Son. How many people in Israel, right before the crucifixion and even after that with his resurrection, how many people in Israel thought that God's only begotten Son was crazy? God does not mind if there is an eternal purpose to cause your social reputation to be damaged, nor mine. The question is, what's going to be of the greatest concern for you? The wrong response is to fear all these social pressures and hence disobey God. If that's the wrong response, then what is the right response for God's children? Well, the right response to God's spiritual pressure is to fear God more and obey. Fear and obedience. The Bible teaches us that the beginning of wisdom is the fear of the Lord. We should fear God more than we fear the social implications of being obedient to God. And that's what Joseph did. Verse 24, then Joseph did as the angel of the Lord commanded him. Look at verse 25. And did not know her till she had brought forth her firstborn son. I want you to notice, the angel pointed out to Joseph, God knows your plan. Often that would be a good plan. But in this case, God's plan is different. Joseph, even though it's probably going to damage your social reputation, take Mary as your wife right now. And that's exactly what Joseph did. He chose God's plan instead of his good plan. And today we're still talking about Joseph. What did that cost Joseph? Well, we've been talking about on the one, he's probably sacrificed his social reputation as a just man. Because even later we read in the Gospels where people said that Jesus was the son of Joseph and Mary. That's the social perception. So many people that really didn't know the inside story, they believed that Joseph was the daddy of Jesus. And if they heard the chronology, they would believe that Joseph was an unjust man when he got her pregnant before he was supposed to get her pregnant. Now, he sacrificed his social reputation more than likely in many people's eyes, but he sacrificed something else that we read in verse 25. Fellas, let me talk to you for a moment. You who are married. When you got married, days before you got married, what was in your mind that you were like, I can't wait to get married? Quit laughing, Lucy. I heard you laugh. That's right. I don't know if you all are aware of this, but men and women think differently. Women, when they're thinking about marriage, they got the princess wedding thoughts and all these kinds of things. Ladies, I hate to disappoint you. Men are thinking something else. Okay? And I want you to notice, Joseph did not just sacrifice his social reputation. Verse 25 says, and Joseph did not know her till she had brought forth her firstborn son. Do you know what that means? Wedding night, nothing happened. Honeymoon, nothing happened. For 9 months in their marriage, when it was finalized, help me out here, nothing happened. Joseph not only laid down his reputation, Joseph laid down his desires when he said yes to the Lord's plan. I want you to understand, God does not care to put pressure on his people because he's working out an eternal plan of salvation. And yes, sometimes it causes us to feel these social pressures, and yes, sometimes it causes us for our families to think we're crazy, for our coworkers to think we're crazy, for, people to just get upset, culture to hate us, Jesus said. And God's okay calling us to that kind of life. But like with Mary, we saw last week, when we say yes, there are blessings beyond anything this world can give us. But we got to be willing to say yes to God's plan. And sometimes that means saying no to our good plans. And God is still calling on people like this. Let me give you an example that's a little closer to our time. It's still 175 years away from our time. But who's the most famous female Southern Baptist missionary? See, some of you all grew up in Southern Baptist life. You know that answer. Some of you didn't, and that's okay. You don't know that answer. But the most famous female Southern Baptist missionary is a lady called Lottie Moon. Now, Lottie Moon was living, during the middle part, I guess, of the 1800s into the latter part and into the early 1900s, I believe. The thing is Lottie Moon was just a young girl like any young girls in the room here, or some of you who aren't so young, you once were young. You understand? So she has these aspirations of probably getting married and having a family and all. Now, Lottie was raised in a relatively wealthy family in Virginia, and her daddy believed in ladies being educated. He sent her to the University of Virginia, where she met a young man by the name of Crawford Toy. Now, Crawford Toy would one day become even a professor at the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary and later on to Harvard University. Now, he was a brilliant young theological scholar. Now, during their time, they had a fond affection for one another, and after they both graduated, eventually Crawford Toy proposed marriage to Lottie Moon. Lottie Moon's just like any of you ladies. She has this dream of what life should be, a good plan. And yet, she was at a place in her life that she realized, but God had a different plan. Now, something about Crawford Toy that I already alluded to, that he began as a seminary professor at the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary, but eventually left and went to Harvard University. Why? Because he had swallowed all of the liberal theology that was coming out of the European academic context. So he was becoming more and more liberally minded. Lottie Moon realized this and realized she did not agree with him theologically. And even though she had strong feelings for him, she knew this marriage would not work because of their differences in their view of God. And she said no to the proposal. She set aside all of these good dreams of marriage because they were on different wavelengths theologically and spiritually. Now, even after 1873, when Lottie Moon went to China as a single woman, Crawford Toy was still sending her love letters and asking for her hand in marriage, and she continually rebuffed Crawford Toy's proposals because, one, she was called to China. He did not feel called there. Two, he was theologically on a different wavelength than she was, and she continually said no and no until she finally said, "Stop asking me," and broke the relationship off completely. Why? Later in life, she was writing letters to her friends. Let me share 3 statements she made about her decision to say no to the man she loved. She said, "God had first claim on my life, and since the 2 claims conflicted, there could be no question which must be obeyed." She also wrote in another place, she said, "I cannot marry Crawford Toy. God has called me to China. I must obey." And then in a latter recollection, as if she were talking to Crawford himself, she said, "I cannot be yours. God has called me to China. I have given my life to God's work. I can never be yours." Does God today still call his people to do things that other people that they care for do not understand? Yes. That other people will try to pressure and keep trying to get you to do what they think is their good plan? Yes. And there are times, like Lottie Moon, like Mary and Joseph, there's times they have to prayerfully seek God's plan versus good plans. And then they've got a decision they got to make. Now, I don't know what's going on in your lives, but I do know God's pattern of working with his people hasn't changed over 2,000 years. And God may be calling some of you of his people to do something that in your mind you're thinking, the people who know me are going to think I am absolutely crazy. Well, just because it sounds crazy doesn't mean it's God's plan. Just because it sounds crazy doesn't mean it is God's plan. That's what you've got to work out prayerfully with fear and trepidation. God, what is your plan? But let me tell you, he sometimes asks you to do crazy things. And it troubles us and people around us. But let me tell you from my own life experience, when you say yes, there are blessings you would have never had otherwise. And the intimacy with your Creator will grow. The intimacy, the love.